Julian Croft's world was a system of controlled variables. From his office on the 80th floor of the Croft Enterprises Tower, he commanded a global logistics empire built on a single principle: predictability. His mind, a finely tuned instrument for risk mitigation, saw emotion as the most dangerous variable of all, an unpredictable surge that could corrupt the entire system. It was a liability he had ruthlessly excised from his own life, a process that had made him formidably successful and profoundly alone. The port strike in Busan is a non-issue, he said, his voice a flat line of authority that carried across the speakerphone to his team in Singapore. Reroute the Class 41 hazmat containers through our hub in Yokohama. I want our transport management system updated with the new routing tables within the hour. And what's the status on the de minimis threshold changes from the new U.S. administration? He listened, his gaze fixed on the digital dashboard that translated the chaotic flow of global trade into clean, manageable data streams. He processed information on procurement delays, third-party logistics provider performance, and network design optimizations with the same dispassionate clarity. This was his sanctuary, a world of solvable problems, of inputs and outputs, where every contingency could be planned for and every disruption managed. This obsession with control wasn't just a professional methodology. It was a psychological fortress. Years ago, a betrayal by his first business partner, a friend who had used personal vulnerabilities shared in confidence to stage a corporate coup, had taught him a brutal lesson. Trust was a resource with catastrophic downside risk. He had walled off that part of himself, compartmentalizing his life so effectively that his work became not just a job, but the entire architecture of his existence. The all-consuming nature of being a CEO was a convenient and profitable justification for his emotional detachment. He managed the flow of goods across continents because he could not manage the chaotic flow of human connection. Elena arrived for her night shift carrying the weight of the day. It was the anniversary of her sister Sarah's death, a date that always left a hollow ache in her chest. Her usual babysitter, an elderly neighbor, had a family emergency, and Elena was left with a stark choice: miss a shift she couldn't afford to lose, or bring her 5-year-old nephew, Leo, with her. The money from this week's work was earmarked for a new round of therapy, a specialized program for children with selective mutism that was agonizingly expensive and her only hope for helping Leo find his voice again. After a pleading call, her supervisor had granted a reluctant, one-time permission. The conditions were strict. The boy had to be asleep and remain unseen in a small utility closet on the 80th floor. It was a violation of a dozen company policies, a risk that sent a tremor of anxiety through her. But the thought of Leo's silence was a far greater fear. She settled a sleeping Leo into a makeshift bed of blankets in the cramped, windowless closet, the scent of industrial cleaning supplies sharp in the air. He was the quiet center of her world, a world defined by quiet resilience and a fierce, protective love. Her work was a means to an end, the end being the sound of her nephew's laughter, a sound she hadn't heard in 2 years. The first sign of failure was a flicker. The brilliant lights of the 80th floor stuttered, dimmed, and then died, plunging the suite into an unnerving twilight cast by the emergency strips along the floor. A citywide power grid failure, as she would later learn. In a building that was a monument to logistical perfection, the backup generators for the executive floors failed to engage. A maintenance oversight, a single point of failure in an otherwise flawless system. Elena's heart leaped into her throat. Her first thought was of Leo. She rushed to the utility closet, her hands fumbling for the handle in the gloom. The sudden darkness had woken him, and his eyes were wide with a silent, consuming terror. She scooped him into her arms and carried him into the relative openness of Julian Croft's office, the storm outside the panoramic windows beginning to build. That was where Julian found them. Working late, he had been in the server room on the floor below when the power went out. He emerged into the darkness of his own office to find an anomaly, the cleaner, and a small, terrified child huddled in the corner. His reaction was not just annoyance. It was the cold, sharp anger of a system breach. An unauthorized, uncontrolled variable had compromised his most secure environment. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the dark. "This is a secure floor. not a shelter. Elena flinched, pulling Leo closer. The sheer power radiating from the man was intimidating, but seeing the fear in Leo's eyes ignited a spark of defiance. The power went out, she said, her voice tight with a mix of fear and anger. He's a child, and he's scared. I'm sorry if that's an inconvenience to your balance sheet. The challenge, quiet but unmistakable, hung in the air between them. Before Julian could formulate a response, a deafening crack of thunder shook the tower. The emergency lighting flickered again, and the world outside the glass dissolved into a wall of torrential rain. The storm had trapped them. Julian Croft, the master of control, was caged with the one thing he could not manage: the messy, unpredictable reality of human fear. The lockdown stripped Julian of his power. The internet was down, cell service was non-existent, his empire was unreachable. He paced the length of his office, a caged animal, his mind cycling through override protocols and contingency plans, all of them useless. He was trapped, and his frustration mounted with every passing minute. Elena, however, had forgotten he was even there. Her entire universe had contracted to the small, trembling boy in her arms. Leo, overwhelmed by the darkness and the percussive roar of the thunder, had retreated deep within himself. He wasn't crying or screaming. He had entered a state known in clinical terms as a freeze response, a hallmark of his anxiety disorder. His body was stiff and motionless, his face a blank mask, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, refusing all contact. He was a statue of fear. Julian stopped pacing to watch. He saw Elena kneel in front of the boy, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't try to coax him or pressure him to speak. A tactic she had learned was not only futile, but harmful. Instead, she began to speak in a low, steady murmur, her voice a calm anchor in the storm. "It's just the sky making a lot of noise, little rabbit," she whispered. "We're safe in here." She sat beside him, not touching him at first, simply sharing his space. Then she gently took his hand and began to trace slow, repetitive patterns on his palm with her finger. It was a simple sensory game designed to ground him in the present, to create a small, predictable bubble of safety in the overwhelming chaos. Julian watched, a strange mix of irritation and unwilling fascination churning within him. This woman, a person he would normally never notice, was demonstrating a form of crisis management he had never encountered. It wasn't about command or control. It was about creating calm from nothing. It was a power he couldn't acquire, a skill he couldn't buy. As Leo's rigid posture began to soften fractionally, Elena reached into her worn purse. She pulled out her wallet, and from a frayed plastic sleeve, she carefully extracted a faded photograph. It was her most precious object, a tangible piece of a life that was gone. She held it out for Leo. "Look, Leo," she murmured, her voice thick with a grief that was always just beneath the surface. "It's Mama Sarah." Julian, standing by the window, heard the name and glanced over. In the dim orange glow of the emergency lights, he saw the image. A younger Elena, smiling, her arm around another woman. A woman with a vibrant, infectious laugh he remembered with a sudden, jolting clarity. A woman he had known, briefly and intensely, 6 years ago. Sarah. He froze. His carefully ordered world tilted on its axis. It wasn't a full memory, but a sudden, overwhelming sensory drip. The faint, remembered scent of gardenias she always wore. The specific cadence of her laughter. The feeling of her hand in his. He had systematically excised her from his life after their affair, terrified by the vulnerability she had exposed in him. He had convinced himself it was a necessary, logical decision. Now, her ghost was in his office, in a photograph held by a stranger. The sight didn't immediately connect to the child beside her. His first reaction was the profound shock of a buried past being violently unearthed. Julian's mind, reeling from the shock, defaulted to its operational mode, data acquisition and control. He crossed the room, his movements stiff, his face an unreadable mask. He was no longer a man trapped in a storm. He was a lawyer deposing a hostile witness, trying to force this impossible new data point into a logical framework. "Where did you get that photograph?" he asked, his tone cold, clinical, stripped of all emotion. What was your relationship to Sarah Jenkins? He was trying to manage the situation, to categorize the information, to contain the emotional fallout before it could breach his defenses. He was treating a moment of profound human connection like a hostile takeover, and the sheer, unfeeling nature of his interrogation was the final spark on Elena's frayed nerves. Years of suppressed grief, anger, and resentment for her sister's fate erupted. Elena rose to her feet, her eyes blazing with a fire Julian had never seen in another human being. This was not a quiet, dignified cleaner. This was a woman defending the memory of the person she loved most in the world. My relationship? She shot back, her voice trembling with rage. She was my sister. My baby sister, who came back from her little romance with the big-shot CEO with her heart broken. You told her there was no future, that attachments were a liability to your ambition. So she walked away. Her words were like blows, each one landing with brutal precision. She found out she was pregnant a month after you cut her off. And she chose to have the baby alone because she knew you'd see him as just another complication, another line item in the debit column. She was scared and she was alone, but she was so brave. She wanted this baby more than anything. Elena's voice cracked, the fury giving way to a raw 5-year-old grief. She died 2 days after Leo was born, a postpartum embolism. The doctor said it was sudden, a 1 in a million chance. But I know what it was. She died of a broken heart, one that you broke because you were too much of a coward to feel anything. The accusation, delivered with such raw, unvarnished fury, shattered Julian's composure. The name, the timeline, the consequences, he stumbled back, his hand finding the edge of his desk for support. He looked from Elena's tear-streaked, furious face to the photograph, and then he truly looked at Leo for the first time. He saw past the disruption, past the anomaly. He saw the boy's features, tracing the ghost of his own jawline, the unmistakable shape of his own eyes staring back at him from a small 5-year-old face. The world dissolved into a dizzying roar. His fortress of emotional detachment, so carefully constructed over years of disciplined effort, didn't just crack, it imploded. But the first wave to wash over him wasn't love or remorse. It was the cold, terrifying shock of a catastrophic system failure. He had a son, a 5-year-old variable that had just rendered his entire life's operating system obsolete. His mind, a machine built for analysis, began to spin, grasping for familiar concepts in the wreckage. Contingency, verification, liability, protocol. This was an unverified claim, a potential risk of staggering magnitude. The emotional reality was too vast, too terrifying to process. First, he needed data. He needed proof. The storm passed, and the city's power grid hummed back to life. For Julian, the return of electricity only illuminated the wreckage of his own world. His first official act was not one of outreach, but of control. He had his corporate lawyer, a man accustomed to handling sensitive acquisitions and hostile takeovers, contact Elena. The call was a masterpiece of impersonal, clinical brutality. The lawyer, speaking in calm, measured tones, formally requested a paternity test to verify the claim and establish a legal framework for future support. Elena, who had spent the week in a daze of grief and renewed anger, felt the request like a physical blow. It was another insult, a confirmation that to Julian, this was not about a son, but about a liability to be managed. She found a pro bono legal aid contact through a community center and responded through her own counsel. Her terms were simple and non-negotiable. The test would be administered by a neutral third party of her choosing. All communication would go through their respective lawyers. She would not speak to him directly. She was drawing a hard boundary, refusing to be a passive party in the auditing of her life. The battle lines were drawn. While they awaited the results, Julian reverted to the only tool he had ever trusted to solve a problem: money. Through his lawyer, he made an offer. A multi-million-dollar trust fund for Leo, a house for Elena in any neighborhood she chose, a lifetime stipend that would mean she would never have to work again. It was a comprehensive, overwhelming attempt to buy his way out of the emotional complexity he could not face. Elena's response, delivered via her lawyer, was a single furious sentence. "Tell Mr. Croft that my sister's life and my son's future are not for sale." The rejection stunned Julian. He had never encountered a problem that sufficient capital could not solve. He was adrift, his usual methods rendered useless. The class and cultural chasm between them was no longer a subtle subtext. It was a gaping canyon he had no idea how to cross. Her integrity was a currency he didn't recognize and couldn't devalue. The results arrived in a sealed envelope delivered by courier. Julian opened it with trembling hands. The language was cold, scientific, absolute. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. The data was in. The fact was verified. And now, with no uncertainty left to hide behind, the full emotional weight of the last month crashed down on him. He was a father. He had a son who was a stranger to him, a son whose silence was a direct consequence of a life Julian had helped to shatter. Lost and stymied, he turned to the only methodology he had left: research. For nights, he abandoned market analysis reports and instead devoured medical journals and parent forums on selective mutism. He learned about the anxiety-driven freeze response, the neurological underpinnings of the disorder, and the therapeutic strategies used to treat it. He read about stimulus fading and shaping, about the critical importance of creating a low-pressure environment and avoiding direct questions. He arranged a meeting through their lawyers on neutral ground, a quiet, little-used park midway between his downtown tower and her apartment. When Elena and Leo arrived, Julian was already there, sitting on a bench, seemingly engrossed in his tablet. He didn't approach them, he didn't speak. He was practicing what the articles called brave waiting. After a few minutes, he took 2 juice boxes from his bag, opened one for himself, and placed the other on the bench beside him, a silent offering. Leo, who had been clinging to Elena's leg, watched him with wide, wary eyes. After a long, tense silence, he took a hesitant step toward the bench, snatched the juice box, and scurried back to his aunt. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't make a sound. But he had accepted the offering. It was a tiny, awkward, almost imperceptible step, but for Julian, it felt like a seismic shift. It was the beginning of a new methodology. After several more of these strange silent park meetings, each one a small exercise in patience and restraint, Julian requested to speak with Elena alone. She agreed, and they met at his apartment, a place as stark and emotionally sterile as his office. Excuses, he didn't try to justify his past. He simply looked at her and delivered his first true apology. "I was wrong, Elena, for how I ended things with Sarah, for not being the man she deserved, for the fact that you have had to carry all of this alone. I am sorry." Then, for the first time in his adult life, he willingly made himself vulnerable. He told her about his first company, about the friend and co-founder he had trusted implicitly. He described how that friend had used personal details, fears, and insecurities Julian had shared in confidence to engineer a boardroom coup that had almost bankrupted him. "He used my trust as leverage," Julian said, his voice quiet, the memory still raw. "I made a decision that day. I decided that trust was a liability, an emotional asset I could no longer afford to allocate. I built my life around that decision." He wasn't asking for absolution, he was offering an explanation. Elena listened, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. But as he spoke, something in her gaze softened. For the first time, she saw past the titan of industry, past the man who had abandoned her sister, and saw a flicker of the wounded man hiding inside the fortress. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. Julian understood that atonement could not be an abstract concept. It had to be a concrete action. He couldn't fix the past, but he could build a better future. And he would do it using the one skill set he had mastered. He didn't just write a check to a charity, he created a new one from the ground up. He presented the plan to Elena in the form of a detailed prospectus. It was for the Leo Croft Foundation, a nonprofit designed to solve a critical logistical problem for families with special needs children. Using sophisticated routing software, a dedicated fleet of accessible vehicles, and a network of volunteer drivers, the foundation would provide free, reliable transportation for children who needed to get to distant therapy sessions and specialized medical appointments. It was a solution to the last mile problem of pediatric healthcare. "I can build the infrastructure," he told her, spreading the blueprints across her small kitchen table. "I can manage the operations, the funding, the technology. That's what I do. But I don't know what these families actually need. I don't have the perspective. You do." He offered her a salaried position as the foundation's co-director. It wasn't a handout. It was a partnership. He was acknowledging that her lived experience, her emotional intelligence, was an asset as valuable as his capital and logistical expertise. The following spring, the foundation was operational. The final scene takes place at a playground, one built with a grant from the foundation, designed to be accessible for children with a range of physical and sensory needs. Julian, Elena, and Leo are there, bathed in the warm afternoon sun. Julian pushes Leo on a specially designed swing. His internal monologue is a quiet battle. He finds himself instinctively tracking Leo's progress, quantifying his interactions, fighting the urge to push for more words, more engagement. He has to consciously force himself to relax, to be present, to let the moment be what it is. He is actively, painfully, working against the core of his own nature. The transformation is not a destination he has reached. It is an ongoing, daily process of unlearning. Elena watches them from a nearby bench. The anger that had been her constant companion for years has faded, replaced by a fragile, cautious hope. She sees the effort Julian is making, the genuine struggle on his face. She sees a man trying to rebuild himself from the blueprints of his own failure. Leo, finished with the swing, makes his way to a small climbing structure. He scrambles halfway up and then stops, his small body tensing with a familiar anxiety. He looks down, his hands frozen on the grips. He looks at Elena, his silent plea for help, a language she knows well. Then, his gaze shifts. He looks directly at Julian, who is standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, deliberately not rushing to rescue him. He is holding his breath, giving the boy space, waiting. A long, charged silence stretches between them. Then, Leo's mouth opens. A small, breathy, almost inaudible sound escapes. "Up!" It is not a plea. It is a command. A single, functional word spoken with intent. An act of agency from a boy who had been powerless for so long. Julian's heart stutters. It feels like a physical impact. He closes the distance in 2 strides, his hands gentle as he reaches up. He lifts his son, and sets him securely on the platform. Leo doesn't look at him, but he doesn't pull away. He simply stands there, at the top, looking out at the world he is slowly, tentatively beginning to reclaim. Julian steps back, a profound, soul-shaking joy mixing with the quiet terror of this new, immense responsibility. It isn't a perfect ending. It is a beginning. A single word, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of silence, and the first step on a long, uncertain road they would now walk together.